Welcome to another episode of Real Estate the Right Way with your host, Michael.Wright, residential realtor on Long Island, New York, delivering the best educational content when it comes to residential real estate. If you appreciate and find value in this content, please give me a like, a comment, subscribe, hit that bell so you're always notified of new videos. Thanks so much. Let's get into it. Today, we're covering the first step of the second step of buying a house. The first step of buying a house is find it. We did a few videos on how to do that. The next step is buy it. What's the first step in buying it? I'm going to tell you today. The first step in buying the house, once you've found it, so congratulations on finding your dream home. That's fantastic. Now we need to buy it. And to buy it, we need to submit an offer of price and terms that are acceptable to the seller. And I want to make a quick point here that an offer is made up of the price and also the terms. If we're just negotiating on price, but the seller has things that aren't about the top number that are important to them, we're negotiating at a distinct disadvantage. They could have something in their head that is super important to them, like a closing date, for instance. Maybe they want a quick one or a short one. And if we're only negotiating on the dollar value that we're willing to pay for the house, we're missing a key component of the other side. We might actually be able to negotiate down a little bit if we're agreeable to their closing timeline. And sometimes that could work out to your benefit greatly. Because it is like when you're moving, maybe you're in a situation where you're renting month to month, and at the exact date that you close, you're super excited that you want to be inside the house, but maybe the date that you actually get the keys isn't as important to you as it is to the seller, and we can agree to abide by the seller's timeline at a better value for the house. So, before we get super distracted down that rabbit hole, let's start at the top of what's called an offer agreement, sales binder, offer. What we're looking at is price and terms that we're presenting to the seller. This is a copy of what I typically write out and send to the listing agent or the seller directly, depending on the situation. So let's get into it. At the top here, we have the buyer's information and the seller's information. Name and address. It's important for the buyer to have their name on the offer agreement as well as the address, because assuming the seller accepts this, it's got to go to the seller's attorney for them to draft the contract, the actual contract. This is a non-binding agreement. The seller's attorney has to draft the contract, and they have to put the buyer's information in the contract. So it's important to have the buyer's address there at the top. We also want to know the property address. And we want to make sure that the property address is the one that you're making the offer on. Believe it or not, being a listing agent as well, I've received offers for either the wrong property, or because they attached the wrong attachment, or just a copy of a previous offer that they made on a different house. They wanted to make the same offer on my listing, but didn't change the property address. So we want to make sure the property address is accurate. And you're not filling this out, your agent is, so make sure they're putting the right address in there. Now we get into the meat of it. The purchase price and really the whole dollar components of the offer. The one that you're probably most familiar with is the top one right here, purchase price. That's how much you're willing to pay for the house. Pretty cut and dry there. We'll do another video on negotiating and kind of different tips and tricks and strategies that we use to negotiate the best value for our clients. But that's not here. We're really sticking to the details, the information of what's inside price and terms. So the first thing, what's the house going to sell for? What are you going to pay for it? That's the purchase price. Then we have the down payment component. And a lot of times, buyers, especially first-time home buyers, tend to think that the down payment is one number. because that's what the loan officer asks. How much are you putting down? That's maybe what the real estate agent asks. How much are you putting down on your mortgage? When it comes to submitting an offer on a property, that down payment amount can actually be split into two different categories. The down payment on contract and also cash at closing. Now, cash at closing is a little misleading. We'll get there, but it's not duffel bags full of cash that you're bringing to the closing table. That screws everything up, especially when there's a bank involved. I've seen it happen. Well, I haven't really seen it happen, but I've heard of it. I've heard of it happening. And it's tough to sort out. Anyway, the down payment on contract and the cash at closing make up the full down payment. I'll give it to you this way. The down payment on contract, assuming the seller agrees to our price and terms, our offer, the seller's attorney will write up the contract, send it to the buyer's attorney. The buyer's attorney will review it, assuming they're okay with the language. The buyer goes to sign the contract and give the down payment on contract, which is typically a personal check. And that personal check is written out to the seller's attorney's escrow account. And that money gets held in escrow for the duration of the contract period, all the way up until closing. And if a buyer is putting 50% down, even 20% down on a home purchase, there's no reason why the seller's attorney has to be responsible for that full amount being held in their escrow account. It just has to be a reasonable amount of money that the buyer's not going to walk away from. It's the buyer's collateral and vested interest in purchasing the home. The seller, their collateral and their agreement to sell you the home is by taking the house off the market. So there's a couple kind of rules of thumb, I guess, that I'll go into real quick about down payment on contract. And just to recap, down payment on contract plus cash at closing is the full down payment. So if you're making a full down payment of, let's say, 20%, then half of that in Nassau County typically gets put on contract. So 10% on contract, 10% at closing. For some reason, in Suffolk County, it's more, I guess, common to put 5% of the 20% down on contract and then bring the remaining 15%, and these are percentages of the purchase price. So if you're putting 20% down, you're borrowing 80%, so the mortgage amount would be 80%. The 20% is then split between the down payment on contract and 15% cash at closing in Suffolk County. Hope that makes sense so far. If not, rewind it, watch it again. I know I'm throwing a lot of numbers at you. So that's for a 20% down loan, financing 80%. If you want to increase the strength of your offer and show the seller that you're fully committed to the house, you might want to consider putting more down on contract. If you were in Suffolk County, let's say, and thinking, well, it's customary to put 5% down, I'll just put 5% down, but man, I really, really want this house, and it's worth it to you after you've discussed it with your agent and your attorney to offer the full 10% down, then go ahead and do it. It's a great strategy to show sellers your commitment to purchase their home. Now, typically, attorneys across the island will advise against putting more than 10% down, and most sellers' attorneys are comfortable with that. If you'd like to know more about that, I have attorneys I can recommend. So the rest of... Oh, you know what? Let's take a quick detour. What if you're not putting 20% down? If you're not putting 20% down, then there's a couple different ways you can do it. If you're putting 15% down, then you could put 5 or 10 on contract, pretty round numbers, and then the remainder at closing. If you're putting 10% down, let's say if you're in Suffolk and you're putting 10% down and 5% is typically the down payment on contract amount, then you would put 5% on contract, 5% at closing, that equals 10, there's your down payment. If you're in Nassau and you're going up against maybe other buyers that are putting 20% down and they're putting 10% on contract, you might want to consider putting the full 10% on contract. Or if you're in Suffolk and you want to make your offer as strong as possible because you're in love with the house, then it might be a good idea to put the full 10% down on contract. It makes a big difference. It makes a big impact in the seller's eyes. What if you're only putting 5% down on contract? Or what if you're getting an FHA loan and that requires 3.5% down? Well, typically in those situations, because you could be going up against other buyers that are putting more down on contract, it's usually a good idea to at least provide the seller with a competitive offer to consider putting that full amount on contract. And I know it could be a lot of money and there are some risks involved, and I urge you to talk to your attorney before you actually sign the contract and before you actually write out that check to determine how that money is at risk, but also how it's protected, before agreeing to exactly how much you're putting down on contract. But to make your offer stand out, to make your offer as strong as possible, if you're putting 5% down, if you're putting 3.5% down, or if you found a 3% down conventional loan, congratulations. I would advise putting that full amount, given the circumstances, in most situations, putting that full amount down on contract. So then the remainder after your down payment is the mortgage amount. And then obviously we discussed cash at closing, which is what's left over. The remainder of the down payment that wasn't put on contract. Follow that so far? Let's keep going. It's not in here, but it's going to be on your pre-approval, and that's the type of financing. Type of financing is important to the seller because different loans have different restrictions, rules, and guidelines. Some sellers want to avoid FHA loans because they come with a little bit more scrutiny and a little bit more requirements for the home. Now, a lot of times, though, that's going back kind of a few years where FHAs were actually quite cumbersome. Now they've kind of streamlined the process, and the list of requirements that a house has to have is not outlandish. It's like handrails. Well, most homes and stairways have handrails. Smoke and CO detectors. Most homes have those. Flooring, walls, lighting, appliances, heat. So FHA loans aren't as cumbersome or as obtrusive as they used to be. However, that stigma can still follow them. So some sellers want to avoid an FHA buyer versus a conventional buyer. And if you could go one way or the other, and that's important to the seller, again, going back to purchase price and negotiating terms, maybe to get a better price for the house, it's worth it to consider going the conventional route as opposed to the FHA, depending on the seller you're negotiating with. So once we've discussed the mortgage financing and all the numbers around our offer, we want to talk about the closing, not the closing date, the closing on or about date. What does closing on or about mean? Well, on or about, customary in legal terms, is within 30 days of. So typically, when we're writing an offer, a general, again, rule of thumb is to put the closing on or about date about 60 days from when you're submitting the offer. So what that gives you, and what it gives the seller, is 60 to 90 days to close, because on or about is plus or minus 30. So if it's October 1st, let's say, and we're writing an offer on October 1st, then 60 days from October 1st would be December 1st. And 30 days from there would be January 1st. So if you're writing an offer on October 1st, the on or about date rule of thumb would be December 1st, and then that would allow the buyer and the seller to close between December 1st and January 1st. And actually, within is plus or minus. So if both the buyers and the sellers are ready before December 1st, that's cool too. Quick note, you only close when the buyer's ready and the seller's ready. Both parties have to be ready. and it has to be within that timeline. So if the buyers are ready and they're like, we're ready, the mortgage is clear to close, let's go, and the seller's like, I haven't packed my stuff yet, it's only December 1st, I have until January 1st, thanks, I'll let you know when I'm all packed. That's they're allowed to do that based on the language in the contract. If the seller says, hey, listen, I'm all packed up, ready to go, movers are coming tomorrow, you ready, buyer? And the buyer's like, geez, I don't have my title back yet, or the town's taking a long time, my surveyor hasn't gotten to the property yet, there's a couple things that I still got to work out before I get the clear to close for my mortgage, I'm not ready yet. And maybe it's still November, maybe it's the first week of December, well, you have the full rest of the month. It's only when both the buyer and the seller are ready to close that we can actually the attorneys can talk to you about scheduling your closing date. But again, going back to the beginning of the video, the reason why we put a closing on or about date inside of the offer is because that's important to the buyer and to the seller. On the buyer, they might have a house that they're selling that they want to get into their next house and line up those closing dates, or they have a lease expiring. Maybe they're renting an apartment and their lease expires in 2 to 3 months, so they want to make sure that they can get into the house by the time their lease expires. The closing date is important to the seller as well, because maybe the seller needs some extended time to find their next house, or maybe they want a quick closing because it's an estate sale, it's a vacant property, and they just kind of want to sell it as quick as possible. Or maybe they found their next home in another state like North Carolina or Florida, where transactions can happen in 30 to 45 days, and they really just want to transfer the title and get the money as fast as possible. So the closing on or about date is important to both the buyer and the seller given their circumstances, and whoever's circumstances are more dire could be advantage to the other party, again, on the purchase price. So let's continue. Inclusions and exclusions. When you make an offer on a home, what's included? Well, if you're looking at an MLS sheet, it will actually say what's included. And typically, the most typical things that are included are appliances, first of all. So it goes from the kitchen, right? Refrigerator, stove, oven, maybe a microwave, dishwasher, wine fridge if you're lucky. And then typically washer, dryer as well. Sometimes, not always. So it's a good idea to understand what appliances are included on the listing and what the seller intends to provide you with the sale of the house. Because it wouldn't be great if you go for the final walkthrough and you're expecting there to be a washer dryer, and you get there and it was excluded in the contract, it was excluded on the listing, and you're getting ready to move into your new house and there's no washer dryer, and now you got to go to an appliance store and the one that you want or the one that they had isn't in stock, and then it becomes a whole big thing. So figure that out up front. You also want to know if there's anything that's excluded, because it's not going to be specifically listed as an inclusion, but it's assumed that other things that are attached to the home are staying with the home. For instance, the mailbox, the door knocker, the chandelier in the foyer or the dining room. Maybe they have a chandelier in a walk-in closet. If those are not included, if they're physically attached to the house, they need to be specifically excluded on the listing and specifically excluded in the contract as well. So there's an example that's pretty commonly used in real estate, and that's if you have a house, take the roof off, lift it up, turn it upside down, shake it out. Anything that falls out belongs to the seller. Anything that stays that's attached belongs to the buyer. It's communicated with a lot more specificity in the listing and in the contract, so you know exactly what to expect when you get there. Because in this day and age, with flat screen TVs and some other things along the way, I don't know, maybe a workout gym that's attached to the wall, awesome garage cabinets that are installed. There's a couple different variables that you want explicitly written so that you know what you're paying for or what the seller is keeping. Let's continue. The next thing that we want to highlight, or that I'd like to explain, are certain contingencies that you can use to either make your offer more favorable to you or more favorable to the seller. Each one of these contingencies can be a little bit long-winded on why it would be important to the buyer or the seller. So I'm going to do a separate video specifically around contingencies that buyers can use to negotiate either in their favor or in the seller's favor. But examples of contingencies could be not doing a home inspection, which I don't necessarily recommend, but it's something that I've received in offers when I'm on the list side, and if a buyer's willing to do that, they go right to contract. It can be pretty advantageous depending on the circumstances. Another contingency could be a seller's concession, where a buyer actually rolls in a portion or all of their closing costs into their mortgage. Pretty advantageous to the buyer. Another contingency that's written into the contract is an appraisal contingency, right? The bank has to do an appraisal on the property before they lend the money to make sure that the money that they're lending, that the house is worth it, so that the bank is making a good investment. A buyer could say, no matter what the house appraises at, I'm going to buy it. Sometimes they say, as long as the house appraises within X dollar amount from what I'm willing to pay, I'll move forward at that price. Some buyers have waived the mortgage contingency altogether, which actually is an important note here. In the market that we're just coming out of, there's been a lot of cash offers, and people have said, geez, like, how do all these people have hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash? I mean, some do, but in a lot of situations, when you make a cash offer, the buyer isn't actually paying cash. The cash offer means there's no mortgage contingency. So if they had to pay cash, they would. Or if they had to lend money privately, they could. In a lot of circumstances, the buyer who is confident in their ability to obtain their mortgage and confident in their employment or their investments, they can say that they're making a cash offer because they're confident that they're going to get the loan. And if they don't get the loan, they can buy it another way, but they're making a cash offer, and a cash offer can be important to the seller because, well, there's no bank involved. So they don't have to worry about an appraisal. The seller doesn't have to worry about this extra entity kind of mucking things up a little bit. So those are a little bit about contingencies. And then also, we want to know who the buyer's attorney is. So this is the last piece. It's all the way at the bottom. Is it really that important? Yes, it is, for a number of reasons. A good or a great real estate attorney, they're a little hard to find, but they're worth every penny. Listen, you're making a purchase that's several $100,000, could be even into the millions. If you're looking to save a couple $100 on your attorney, let me tell you, this is not the place to save a couple $100. You want an experienced residential real estate attorney. An attorney that a real estate agent has worked with before when you're on the listing side. If that listing agent has had a good experience or a positive experience with the attorney that you're using, that's going to work in your favor when they're explaining that offer to the seller. If the buyer's agent is saying, hey, listing agent, my client, my buyer, is using my recommended loan officer and my recommended attorney and my recommended home inspector, the buyer is in great hands because they're working with trusted professionals that they're trusted real estate agent is recommending. But on the list side, the listing agent and the seller become more comfortable because they know that maybe if they don't even have a direct relationship with those professionals or direct experience with those professionals, that real estate agent does. And that real estate agent isn't going to recommend someone who's going to make their life harder. So if the buyer's agent is looking to make their life, I don't want to say a little bit easier, but but they're making their life and their client's life simpler and less stressful because you're dealing with qualified professionals, that smoothness and that efficiencies and effectiveness in those professionals will move towards the seller and give the seller a more positive experience as well. And a more positive experience to the seller means value. And when that has value, we can go back to the purchase price and say, hey, listen, we're working with a professional team that I have confidence in. This is our offer. Even if you have a better one, it's going to be more complicated down the road. We're the offer to go with. So, in summary, when you're making an offer on a property, make sure you discuss with your buyer's agent not only the purchase price, what you're willing to pay for the house, but all of the other terms that are involved. You also want to make sure that your agent is asking the seller or the listing agent what's important to them. And the question isn't, well, what's important to the seller? Because that's very vague, it's very open-ended, and you're likely not going to get an answer, or the answer that you're likely going to get is the highest price. Got to dig a little bit deeper, be a little bit more creative with your questions. When is the seller looking to leave? Do they have their next house picked out? Would they like to keep the chandeliers? Are they taking them with them? Are they family heirlooms? Ask some specific qualifying questions, get inside the seller's situation, and then you'll be able to figure out exactly what's important to them and negotiate from a position of strength. Thank you so much for watching. My name is Michael.Wright. This has been another episode of Real Estate the Right Way. Please give me a comment, give me a like, subscribe to the channel, and hit that bell so you're always notified of new videos. Thanks again. And as always, tell me what home means to you, and I'll help you get there.